Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show focused on the ideas, projects, and people building the new digital economy and the future of money. If you're brand new to Bitcoin and would like to learn more, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/learn to be directed to the Bitcoin Education Project. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to talk about complicated topics in understandable terms. Joining me in our twice-weekly search for clarity, Andreas M. Antonopoulos is an expert in distributed systems and decentralized networks.
Hi there.
Dr. Stephanie Murphy is a scientist and syndicated radio host.
Hey.
So we're going to jump right into listener emails today because we've got one and it's a pretty long discussion topic, so let's get right into it. Hi Adam, really enjoy the show. I have a question that I hopes you could give some insight on. As I understand it, micropayments are not really feasible at the moment. Do you see that as being resolved in the future? I wonder because it seems there could be a system of pay-as-you-use websites and services that allows something like a social network without ads or any kind of invasion of privacy. People could choose the option for something like Facebook or a separate network with this model. The only problem is that it would need to involve such small payments that I don't know how such transactions could be done. In the same vein, would it be feasible for a similar system to exist, but instead of payments, the user provides bits of mining for the site? Maybe this has all been covered, but it just seems like people could pay half a penny or so each day they use Facebook, but eliminate all the ads and other intrusions. It would probably be worth it for everyone involved. Thanks. This is where I see the most potential for Bitcoin. You know, when you talk about large transactions, that side is kind of almost already taken care of by the existing financial structures that we already have. Sure, there are costs and fees associated with it, but it's possible to do it, as opposed to these microtransaction concepts where you're sending pennies worth of value or 10 cents worth of value. That's pretty hard in the existing system. So, you know, I mean, again, this follows on the topic that we spent a bit of time on last episode, talking about kind of the idea of neutrality and which transactions are okay, which transactions aren't okay. At this point, you know, do you guys think that microtransactions in the penny range are feasible? And, you know, moving forward, what does that look like?
I think there will be a solution that's created as long as people have an incentive, like Facebook or whoever, to make money off of this. I mean, it's kind of as simple as that. Something that I could envision would be them kind of bundling these micropayments. So, you know, you wait till you have a month's worth of penny payments, or you pay in advance for a month or something like that. Perhaps they subsidize the transaction fees and they bundle the payments together. It's really up to them to get creative to kind of solve that problem. It also brings up the question of what is a micropayment. You know, we don't really have a firm amount under which we can say, yes, this is definitely a micropayment. It's kind of a sliding scale. And so as the natural disincentives that come with smaller payments become evident, like the transaction fee potentially overshadowing the actual amount that's being sent, there'll be more incentives to bundle those payments into larger payments and avoid having these kind of dust transactions.
I think this is more easily solvable if we stop thinking of dust transactions in the context of Western developed countries. This is all about the other 6 billion, the unbanked, the people who live around the world not in developed countries. So the real microtransaction is what it costs to buy a cup of coffee in the Sudan or in a small cafe on a beach in Indonesia. A couple of rupees, 10 rupees, someone talked about that at the conference, in fact. They challenged the developers and said, you know, what you think of a microtransaction is not a microtransaction in my country. We would like to see 10 rupee transactions. Just for context, the minimum fee that's set in the client and accepted by most is 0.0005 Bitcoin, or what is that, half a millibit. And half a millibit is 6.25 cents on the US dollar, if you do the translation. I may have gotten that wrong. But the bottom line is that puts a lower limit. At most, if you consider the microtransaction one that is no less than twice the size of the fee. So you can really pay about 12 cents, half of it going to the fee and half of it going to the transaction right now. That's the lower limit. But the whole point of that change made recently was to allow miners to gradually reduce that limit while enabling market mechanisms to properly compensate them for including smaller and smaller transactions in the blockchain.
Yeah, I think that the idea of of defining microtransactions is challenging, but it's very contextual. Because, you're thinking about it from the other 6 billion perspective, but, my primary area of focus has been content monetization. And so microtransactions are a huge deal there. When people use PayPal, the minimum that they're going to send somewhere is, between $2.50 and $5. Below that, it doesn't really make any sense with the fee structure. And just in general, I've never heard of anyone even asking for payments much below that outside of flat out donations where the fee is being waived by the company. For my purposes, when I think of microtransactions, I'm thinking of anything that's like $1 or less. $1 and below is something that nearly anybody has the ability in, again, the developed world. Once you start talking about the Sudan, then obviously the equation changes. But in the developed world, that's a doable figure for just about anybody. And for even people who don't want to buy something but just want to support something, those are the numbers where it kind of makes sense. And so with that in mind, that's a 6.5% transaction fee on something that is ostensibly supposed to be tailored towards these small transactions. And ultimately, that's a pretty large number. You're still talking about, that's like 0.008 of a Bitcoin, I think, for like $1 transaction at current exchange rates. I think that the solution in the long term here is to try not to screw it up by putting rules in place, and then over the long term move to mechanisms so that it isn't being set by a person or a group of people, and so the rate can be floated, and you can have people who have high priority transactions subsidizing people who have low priority transactions and are essentially doing micropayments.
Yeah, I like that.
Even in your content monetization scheme, Adam, if someone was paying, say, $2 or $3 a month to follow their favorite website and wanted to be able to read 100 pieces of content on that site and wanted to make that up with micropayments, essentially you're looking at enabling micropayments of 2 to 3 cents per piece of content to get 100 pieces of content to add up to a couple of dollars, right, which most people would feel comfortable with. So it's even in your content monetization scheme, you're looking at that. And in that case, the fee is 300%.
Right. Right, exactly.
Now, let's point out, that's the current fee, right? So there's two issues here. One is the minimum fee was recently changed into a parameter rather than fixed in code so that over time, it can be set independently by miners to create a market. And there's no market mechanism yet, but that's the goal. The second thing is to think about this being highly dependent on the current value of a Bitcoin. Essentially, over time, the deflationary pressure causes increases in the percentage of the fees. If Bitcoin was $1,000 today, suddenly that 5 millibit transaction fee is $6, and we're PayPal again.
The setting of the parameters ultimately has to change, and it looks like we're moving in that direction. The stopgap, Stephanie, I think is what you described, where basically you have an entity like Facebook. Again, in the listener's example, if Facebook was going to, instead of running ads, charge everybody 1 penny a day, for example, to have a Facebook account that's active, then Facebook could, of course, take 30 pennies and say, okay, well, here's your month worth of contribution, rather than doing it as each daily, we'll just do it as a month. And then, of course, so one of the exciting things about Bitcoin from a capability standpoint is that by enabling small stuff, it enables you to be really granular. Granular and granularity are words that I like to use when talking about this stuff, because it means that you can take something that's very large, like, say, a whole Bitcoin, and divide it into 100,000 pieces and treat each piece as its own little entity that, put together as a whole makes up a whole, but you can take each, individual grain as its own entity unto itself, and you're still able to perform transactions with it in the same way as you can with this larger stuff. It's the same thing here. You're taking a month and you're trying to shrink it down into 30 days. And then you take each of those days and you shrink it down into hours. And so technically, if we can work out this system where transaction fees are based on utility and based on, speed of delivery rather than just a flat rate, then you can do all of these really, really small things, and it probably will be okay for the system overall.
Adam, you're absolutely right. But the issue here is that if you try to bundle these transactions, you run into a couple of other problems. The first one is that you need to do some rather complex accounting. And the second problem is that Bitcoin is a push mechanism, not a pull mechanism. So you can't do recurring charges and debit someone. You have to essentially have them pay in advance for a month. which means then you can't really do that based on the content they consume, because they consume the content first and then they bundle the payment later, or you'd have to top up their account, and it gets really, really complicated. So the solution essentially ends up messing up with the accounting of microtransactions. It would be much better if for every piece of content you could charge individually if you want or not, and do the microtransaction right there and then, and not try to bundle these microtransactions together. But, I think we're getting there. The point is that the minimum fee as it is set now is simply a parameter. And over time, the idea is that the minimum fee is the correct price point at which the supply of space in the blockchain meets the demand for transaction size. We have to think of that price equilibrium not as a point in space, but essentially as a curve. And that curve exponentially decreases over time as the value of Bitcoin increases, as the size of the blockchain increases, and as the number of transactions increases. So the deflationary spiral is reflected directly in the transaction fee, and over time that curve drops it until you're talking about charging satoshis for satoshis, right? Not percentage of Bitcoin or 5 millibits. It's millibits, then nanobits, then femtobits, all the way down to satoshis. That fee is going to have to move on a curve.
Talking about the bundling problem and how you have to get people to pay before they... One of the other pieces that I like to think my focus on this monetization topic has spawned is actually a paywall application that won the hackathon at the Bitcoin 2013 conference. And, when I first looked at this, I was like, that's not really going to work, because I'm not a big fan of paywalls. I think that they haven't ever really been implemented successfully, and you wind up sacrificing more of your audience than you gain from monetizing them, because you essentially say, you can't read our content, you can't look at our content until you've paid us. And so that makes it so a lot of people just will say, okay, well, never mind your content then. So anyways, I met yesterday with one of the guys who's developing this platform, and they've come up with a really innovative way to do it. And basically what it is it's not a paywall, it's a retroactive, essentially, donation request, right? Where it keeps track of the articles that you've viewed, and after you've viewed a certain number of articles, it pops them up and says, would you like to, give value to any of these things? And so they have a way that you can onboard, an amount, and then they do their microtransaction thing to get around the transaction fee. But I thought that was really interesting. It's like a retroactive paywall where it doesn't actually restrict you. It just does a proactive request for financing. And so they're going to try to push this out to the Wall Street Journal and stuff.
Yeah, if you think about it, publishing is essentially dying because of an inability to charge for content at a level that makes sense for people who are used to free. That model could really be revitalized if you just have the flexibility to get to microtransactions.
I think that's a really neat solution, and I think we're going to see more solutions by people who are motivated to implement easy ways to do value for value. And I think that's something that definitely content producers are demanding and that there's a real use for. So it'll happen. Maybe we don't know exactly how, but it'll happen if it makes sense.
And if you take the lower end of the microtransaction and move it down, it creates an environment. It opens up this greenfield opportunity, this never seen before opportunity. Think about it this way. We have never had microtransactions on this scale in the history of humanity. When we were bartering for physical stuff, there's a limit to how small you can shave a chunk of gold or a seashell or a bag of salt. So we're opening up the possibility for completely novel ways of payment and monetization that have never existed before, simply because in the history of humanity, the size of microtransactions has never had the possibility of being this small. But I'd also like to just very quickly point something else out. We keep talking about the low end. I think what's really exciting about Bitcoin as a neutral platform, unlike all other payment systems, it actually spans an enormous range. So just for the listeners' information, the largest transaction I see in the last few weeks here on the blockchain is $2.6 million. Right? So let's put that into perspective. When we talk about Bitcoin, we need to think about a range from femto transactions to giga transactions. And this is brilliant because there has never been a payment system that can span that kind of range. So it's not just about the low end. It's about the entire range and how we widen that to encompass areas of innovation that have never existed before.
What was the transaction fee on that $2.6 million transfer?
5 millibits.
Yeah.
I mean, it was actually a 2 inputs, 2 outputs, very, very small transaction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It does bring up the point that potentially what you'll see in the future is miners specializing in processing certain kinds of transactions by setting their own minimum transaction fees. So you'll have a sort of a division of labor, I guess, among miners where some process sort of microtransactions and some process gigatransactions.
You know, I was wondering about this actually. When we're talking about specialized miners, as you said, that incredibly large transaction was actually a very small transaction as far as the blockchain was concerned because it only involved 2 inputs. Now, we are on the complete other end of that spectrum with our show wallet because we get all kinds of donations in the, 0.00x number of bitcoins. It's a lot of the donations are quite small. So when I wind up making a payment, usually it tells me that my transaction is too large for the amount of fee that I've put on, and that tends to be the standard fee that I use. Is there a use scenario here where you have miners who specialize in taking all of these little transactions and essentially optimizing them into a larger transaction themselves, or is that not something that's possible?
And essentially what you're seeing, Adam, is dust. What you're seeing is that for the current price of Bitcoin, and that's a very critical qualifier, for the current price of Bitcoin, these transactions need to be added up in their hundreds, the transaction outputs, the unspent transaction outputs. They need to be added up in their hundreds in order to create a meaningful amount that you can then transfer to someone else. So if you want to pay $10 and you have 1,000 transactions of a penny each, you need to make a transaction set that has 1,000 inputs and 2 outputs. Yeah, that creates a problem. Not it creates a problem, it's basically just expensive to do because you're taking up a lot of space in the blockchain. The weird thing is the $2.6 million transaction I just talked about is only 258 bytes, pays a 0.5 of a millibit fee, and your transaction with 1,000 inputs would pay 10 times that because it's at least 10 times the size. That's the weird thing about the way transaction fees work in Bitcoin, weird and wonderful, is that they're not dependent on the size of the payment, but rather on how small the inputs are.
Well, looks like we picked the wrong end of the spectrum.
Yeah, so you need to find a content monetization scheme where people pay you $2.5 million per piece of content in one transaction. I think that would be brilliant, Adam.
Okay, I'll work on that.
All we need is one patron.
Or one very special piece of content.
EasyDNS is a DNS provider and domain registrar that shares your values, flexibility, free speech, and control without lock-in. EasyDNS helps you meet your individual needs as the Swiss Army knife for domain names since 1998. Outspoken critics of SOPA and CISPA, EasyDNS was an early supporter of Bitcoin, which fits well with our values and those of our customers. Please support our sponsor and get a 13% discount when you pay with Bitcoin. Learn more at easycoin.com.
You're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly shows include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
So there's a follow-up part to this question from a Facebook user. I want to hear your opinion about the blockchain size limit of 1 megabyte per block, 7 transactions a second. How should we deal with the coming problem? What are the options, the pros and cons of each?
I've been sort of following it and trying my best to understand it. So, excuse me in advance if I get anything incorrect, but the blocks that make up the Bitcoin blockchain are limited in size to 1 megabyte each. They're generated every 10 minutes approximately. And so what that means is that per unit of time, there's only so many transactions that can fit in a 1 megabyte block. This is the 7 transactions per second number that the listener is referencing here. Effectively, there's a limit on how many transactions can go across the Bitcoin network per unit of time. And some people say, even though we're not hitting a wall with that right now, as Bitcoin gets bigger adoption, that is going to become a problem and a hard limit that prevents people from using Bitcoin, or prevents as many people from using Bitcoin as may want to. You could say, okay, why don't they just increase the size of each block so that more transactions can fit within it? Okay, well, there's a problem with that. It may stress out some of the nodes, which are often just home PCs, basically, and it may stress their internet connections and their storage and their processing capacity. So there's clearly sort of a Goldilocks zone for the size of how big each block should be, and people are debating exactly what that is. Is it 1 megabyte? Well, a lot of people are saying that's probably too small. Is it 10? Maybe. But currently the limit is set in the Bitcoin code as 1. So there's a big debate about this, and it also kind of goes into the idea of centralization, right? Because there are some people who are suggesting in this debate that, well, we don't have to change the block size. All we have to do is have basically third parties that do off-chain transactions that process some of these smaller transactions, like sending a few millibits to the Coke machine and then bundle that together and send it to the blockchain at some point. There are some people who have a real problem with having mandatory points that everybody has to trust, mandatory trusted third parties. Some people may choose to trust a third party for off-chain transactions if they want to, but it shouldn't be mandatory. That's really not what Bitcoin was originally about. So it really goes a lot deeper than just the size of the block. And I apologize in advance if I got any of that incorrect. You can email me, Stephanie at letstalkbitcoin.com, if you have comments about that, or if anything I said was not accurate. But that's what I understand of the debate. And that was kind of hard to get.
I'd like to put my debunking hat on. I don't actually have a debunking hat, but if anybody wants to send me one, that's great. Everything you said, Stephanie, is absolutely technically correct. However, I think this discussion is missing a couple of issues. All of these are moving targets. First of all, the current block limit of 1 megabyte was introduced just recently with the latest version. In fact, it was 0.8.1, then we had a little bit of a bug problem, and now it's 0.8.2. It was only introduced recently. It was lower before, and sort of expanding to that block level was part of the goal. From what I understand of the roadmap, the goal is to keep expanding the block size to adjust for scalability and growth in the number of transactions. I don't see a problem with that, honestly, because here's a couple of other things that are at play here. The size of disks is growing faster than Moore's Law. We've seen this explosion of storage capability over the last decade and a half, to the point where effectively the marginal price of a megabyte has dropped to zero, and the cost of storage drops even faster than the cost of computing. In terms of bandwidth, there's a lot of things you can do with Merkle trees, and these basically allow you, instead of sending the entire set of transactions, to basically prune parts of the blockchain, essentially summarize them as a higher level hash. And if you think about it, when you put a client on the blockchain for the first time, yeah, it's going to spend several days downloading 8, 9 gigabytes or whatever the blockchain size is today. But once it's up to date, all it's doing is transferring additional blocks, and those come every 10 minutes. And if you have to download a meg or 2 or 10 once every 10 minutes, that's far less than the demands we put on our systems for video.
Somebody brought up the issue of mining on Tor, and how would a larger block size affect that? Because there are some people who want to be nodes or even mine Bitcoin with privacy using the Tor network.
Well, first of all, you would only need to necessarily transmit on Tor. You could receive and listen and receive the other blocks outside of Tor. They're broadcast in public on the network. So you could create kind of an asymmetric system where you listen for the big blocks coming in. And when you find a block, well, at that point, you've got a 25 Bitcoin reward, making it worth sending out on the Tor network, even if it is a few megs. I'm not really sure how you resolve that, and it may cause some problems for the Tor network. But we do have other kind of layers of solutions here. You have potentially thin clients like Electrum that work on an overlay protocol like Stratum, they don't need to be full nodes. They don't need to have the entire blockchain. Essentially, they have a summary of past transactions based on a hash, and they only build things incrementally with the assistance of trusted servers. And these are not the off-blockchain transactions you were talking about before, Stephanie. These are essentially just act as full nodes and store a trusted inventory of past blocks. But
Can we explain for the listeners who aren't familiar what is the difference between a full node and a half node, a non-full node?
One of the beauties of Bitcoin and the blockchain model is that I don't need to trust anyone. I can take a client, and in that client, in hex, right in the source code, is the Genesis block. It's written down as a hex number. I can send it to everyone. It's in all the source code of every single client. On that, you then can build the second block is basically got a hash of the Genesis block. So with that Genesis block, I can validate the second block. Once I validated the second block, which I can just ask the network to send me, I can use that to validate the third block, and so on and so forth. And once I get to 217,000 blocks, or whatever the current height of the blockchain is, I have a completely independent perspective and verification of every transaction on the network all the way back to the Genesis block that I can trust intrinsically because I verified it and don't need to check with anybody else. That's the beauty of it. Essentially, every transaction that comes in, I can tie it all the way back to the block where it was mined, and I can tie that block all the way back to the first block Satoshi mined. So we all have trust on our nodes. That's a full node. A light node essentially will only validate back in time up to a certain point, and will only keep the difference since then. And essentially will ask other nodes, well, what was the hash of that block? And then build from there. You obviously need a trusted answer, because if someone gives you the wrong hash, then they can subvert your verification mechanism. And that's what Electrum does, as far as I understand it, and I'm sure I'll get corrections by email on this. Essentially what you're doing is you're just verifying a smaller number of blocks or transactions based on almost like a checkpoint, which is higher in the blockchain. So the Electrum servers checkpoint the blockchain for you, and you essentially only look at the difference.
If everybody started using these light nodes, could there be potential problems if nobody were to verify the entire blockchain or act as a full node?
Well, miners, by definition, act as full nodes. So as long as you can talk to miners and ask them, and you can, of course, because you can find out what inventory they have, then you can verify that you're getting the correct information. And because the highest blockchain always wins by consensus on the network, you can just go out and ask randomly many nodes and see what answer you get, and persuade yourself to a degree of probability that what you're hearing is in fact the highest blockchain. So it's not really a problem. If the vast majority of nodes went into light mode, then you would have a problem. But I think that for the foreseeable future, and perhaps with the increase in storage capacity forever, the ability to have a full node, at least on your personal computer or personal server in the cloud, is perfectly feasible. The number of transactions is growing slower than both storage capacity and bandwidth. And we know what the upper limit is. The upper limit today is about 10,000 transactions per second, which occur on the Visa network on Christmas Eve. And even for Visa, that's at least 100 times their normal transaction load. But we really know what the upper limits are today with existing payment networks, and the developers are very clear that we can reach those without running into significant problems.
But the thing that we don't know, and the thing that is still definitely up for debate, is what the network for Bitcoin is going to look like once we have all of these microtransactions involved. Because the Visa network, that you mentioned, yes, it has 10,000 transactions per second at peak, but that is above a certain minimum limit. And for most people, places where they accept Visa, that limit is like $10. So if we're going to take that limit and cut it down to 10 cents, then you've got to imagine more transactions are going to happen.
I think this goes to a certain programming mentality and development mentality and principle, which is absolutely true, which is don't optimize a problem until you have it.
Right.
We don't have a problem. When we have that problem, we can optimize it, but right now there's no reason to start optimizing it in advance. I think a lot of this worry is misplaced. At least from what I hear from the core developers, they're not worried about the ultimate size of the blockchain or the inability to process enough transactions. They are worried about stuff going into the blockchain that isn't spendable and therefore just fills it up with useless information. But that's a whole different problem.
When we talked with Alan Reiner at Bitcoin 2013, this was a topic that came up because with the full node client, you have a lot of security because you're doing all that verification yourself. And so you can trust it because you've essentially verified the whole thing. It's like having the whole ledger there and going through it yourself and doing that, except you outsource it to your computer. The problem with that, of course, is that from a usability standpoint, not everybody has the ability to devote that to it, or frankly wants to wait the 3 days in order to hook up their wallet for the first time. So what they're moving towards is a system of essentially federated servers. It's like when you set your clock on your computer. You can set it yourself, and then eventually it'll fall out of timing because it's based on your computer's internal clock, which usually runs just a little bit slower or faster than the standard because it's based on how fast your cycles are. Or you can sync up with a server online. And so the idea of a federated server is that anybody who wants to run a full node client and make it available online can put it up and make it available from, a drop-down list where you go through and you select 5 or 10 or however many you want to select. And then your computer or your client doesn't just rely on one of them, but rather checks them all and is able to determine, because they're all run by different people and they all have, different interests, it's a safe bet that they're not all colluding against you to make your client act in the wrong way. And so through distributing the trust and the information to these multiple places, you're able to get an accurate reading without exposing yourself to all of the trouble of actually having to do the maintenance and maintain it yourself.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a really important point there. Trust itself is a probabilistic thing. There is no 100% trust. There is no absolute trust. It's really to what probability do you trust the network to give you a correct answer? And is that probability greater or lesser than the cost to mess your transaction up, right? So you're willing to spend a certain amount of money or fees on security and on trust up to the point where it's more than the actual transaction you're trying to protect. And we see this in the real world. We walk around with these little green pieces of paper in our wallet, and we know quite well, or at least most of us know, that probably 1 in 100 of those is forged, is fake, is counterfeit. And we don't check them all the time. I certainly don't hold up every dollar bill to check the watermark. But what we do is we expect that, 1 in 5 merchants or 1 in 10 merchants will put a UV pencil on it or will look at the watermark, especially if the value of the bill is higher. And that's enough because it gives us a level of certainty that there is some checks in the system, and it also gives us some certainty that the next person in the chain will trust our transaction and our currency. You don't need 100% coverage to create trust. You only need kind of this distributed selective checking that gives you a level of certainty higher than what amount you're spending.
I still have another question about this. 2 questions, actually. One of them is, can a node basically choose what maximum size block it would relay or broadcast? Like, could the block size essentially be determined in kind of a market way?
Well, I think that's exactly where it's going. You create this equilibrium where block size is the supply and number of transactions is the demand, and the fee represents the equilibrium point at this moment based on the USD price of Bitcoin, the amount people are trying to transact, the difficulty mining, and all of those other factors. That equilibrium point is reached by the fee. That's the basic idea behind a market mechanism for fees. It's not implemented yet, but I think it will create all kinds of opportunities because by setting that clearly, then people can start innovating around that. Markets will create new services, new capabilities, and new approaches to this that you won't see in a kind of constrained, centralized approach to setting fees or setting block sizes.